I will never forget the night I saw his eyes, glowing like embers in the dark. Those were not the eyes of a man. They were the eyes of something cursed, something beyond this world. If you had told me 3 months ago that I would come face to face with Omakanu, the wicked prince of Jukwan, I would have laughed. After all, stories like his were just that, stories. They were warnings, told by elders to scare children into staying away from the forest. But on that cold, moonlit night, under the shadows of the trees, I realized some stories carry more than words. My journey began when my cousin Oak sent me a letter, begging me to visit his village in Benue. His mother, my aunt, was ill, and he needed help gathering herbs from the forest. I lived in the city then, surrounded by noise, concrete, and lights that never dimmed. A visit to the countryside sounded like a welcome change. The village was smaller than I had imagined, tucked away in a valley surrounded by towering trees. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and the only sounds were the distant hum of insects and the occasional cry of a bird. When I arrived, Oak greeted me warmly, but there was an unease in his eyes. He seemed distracted, his gaze constantly drifting toward the forest. "Is everything all right?" I asked. "Yes," he said quickly, though his voice lacked conviction. "The forest it has its stories." Later that evening, as we sat around the fire, the elders began telling those stories. The legend of Omakanu. Long ago, when the Jukwan people still ruled this land, there was a prince named Omakanu. The eldest among them began, his voice low and gravelly. The firelight danced across his face, casting eerie shadows. Omakanu was the second son of King Adu, a proud and prosperous ruler. From a young age, Omakanu was different, ambitious, cunning, and ruthless. While his elder brother trained to inherit the throne, Omakanu spent his days scheming, dreaming of power. When the king fell ill, Omakanu saw his chance. He poisoned his brother's wine during a feast, ensuring his path to the throne. When the king died, Omakanu declared himself ruler. But power did not satisfy him, the elder continued, his voice tinged with sadness. He taxed the people until they starved. He enslaved the young and executed anyone who dared to defy him. His greed knew no bounds. One day, a wandering diviner came to his court. She was old, with a voice like the wind through dry leaves. Standing before the prince, she spoke a prophecy. "Your greed will chain you to this land, not as a king, but as a shadow. You will wander until the world forgets your name." Omakanu laughed, ordering her execution. But from that day, strange things began happening. His gold turned to ash. His servants disappeared. People whispered of a terrible figure roaming the village at night, searching for something it could never find. When his palace burned to the ground, Omakanu's spirit fled into the forest. It is said he still roams there, bound by his greed and hatred, preying on those who dare enter his domain. The next day, Oak and I set out for the forest to gather the herbs his mother needed. The path was narrow, winding through towering trees that blocked most of the sunlight. The air grew colder the deeper we went, and an eerie silence settled over the forest. "Are you sure we are safe here?" I asked, glancing around nervously. Oak hesitated. "As long as we don't stay after dark." We walked quickly, collecting the plants he needed. But as the sun dipped lower in the sky, the atmosphere changed. The wind picked up, whispering through the trees like a warning. Then we heard its footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and too heavy to belong to any animal. "Who's there?" Oak called, his voice trembling. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, from the shadows, he emerged. He was tall and skeletal, his tattered royal robes clinging to his gaunt frame. His face was pale and hollow, his skin stretched tightly over sharp bones. But it was his eyes that held me captive, two glowing embers, burning with an unnatural light. "I am king," he rasped, his voice dry and cracked like old bark. In one hand, he dragged a child, a boy no older than 10. The boy was limp, his face pale as death. "Leave him," Oak shouted, his voice breaking. The prince's eyes snapped to Oak, and for a moment, the air seemed to freeze. Then, with a bone-chilling screech, he dropped the boy and lunged at us. We ran, crashing through the underbrush, the sound of his pursuit deafening behind us. Branches scratched at my face, and my lungs burned, but I didn't dare look back. When we stumbled into the village, the elders were waiting. They didn't need to ask what had happened. They already knew. The elders' wisdom. "That was Omakanu," one elder said grimly. "You are lucky to have escaped." They explained that the boy we saw was likely a spirit, one of Omakanu's victims. He lures people into the forest with such tricks, feeding on their fear. To protect the village, the elders performed a ritual that lasted until dawn. They chanted prayers, burned herbs, and drew symbols in the dirt. But I couldn't shake the image of Omakanu's eyes. I barely slept that night, haunted by the memory. Returned to the forest. Months passed, but I couldn't forget what I had seen. The encounter had changed something in me. I began researching Omakanu's story, digging through old texts and speaking to anyone who would listen. Finally, I decided to return to the forest. I needed answers. This time, I went alone, armed with the knowledge the elders had shared. I carried protective charms and a staff carved with sacred symbols. The forest felt different this time, darker, more oppressive. I followed the path deeper than before, eventually stumbling upon the ruins of a palace. The air was heavy with the scent of decay. Vines crawled over crumbling walls, and the ground was littered with broken stone. In the center of the ruins stood Omakanu. The truth unveiled. "You've returned," he rasped, his glowing eyes locking onto mine. I raised my staff, trying to steady my trembling hands. "Why are you here? What keeps you bound to this place?" For a moment, he was silent. Then he laughed, a hollow, chilling sound. "I am king," he said, his voice filled with bitterness. "But what is a king without subjects? Without power? I am nothing. And so, I wander, searching for what was taken from me." It was then I realized the truth. Omakanu's curse was not just punishment for his greed, it was his prison. He could not rest until he let go of the very thing that had destroyed him. I stood my ground as he advanced, his skeletal hand reaching for me. The symbols on my staff began to glow, and Omakanu recoiled, hissing in pain. "You cannot defeat me," he growled. "I don't need to," I said, planting the staff into the ground. "You need to defeat yourself." With that, I began reciting the elders' prayers, my voice steadied despite the fear gripping my heart. The air around us seemed to ripple, and Omakanu let out an ear-piercing scream. His form began to fade, his glowing eyes dimming. As he disappeared, the forest grew silent. The oppressive weight lifted, and for the first time, I felt a sense of peace. When I returned to the village, the elders confirmed that the curse had been broken. Omakanu's name would fade into history, and the forest would no longer be a place of fear. But even now, years later, I still hear his voice in my dreams. His story is a reminder of what greed can do, not just to a man, but to an entire kingdom. And though the forest is safe, I know I will never set foot there again.